The 100-year scam that invented hot dogs. The siren cuts through the night shift. Conveyor stops. A steel arm hangs over a vat of glossy pink paste, humming, waiting. The supervisor raises a hand, hesitates, and glances at the wall clock. 20 minutes left to hit quota. Somewhere, a manager's phone buzzes. No one wants to be the reason the line restarts or doesn't. That comfort food on a bun, it was built on scraps, nitrates, and marketing polish. We're tracing a century-long sleight of hand, from wooden carts to chemistry labs to clever labels. The stakes are simple: health risks, loopholes, and nostalgia that hides the mess. To see the trick, we go back to the first carts and the first complaints. Street carts, immigrants, and the birth of mystery meat. Through the 1860s, New York and Chicago streets were breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Pushcarts rattled past factory gates and shipyards, hawking sausages for pennies. German immigrants brought frankfurters and knockwurst, the portable meal that didn't need a plate. Workers needed salt, fat, and speed. Vendors needed volume and heat. A bun solved everything. One hand free, no mess, move along. Behind the cart, packing houses had a different rhythm. Cattle and hogs went in as animals and came out as parts, then trimmings, then scraps. What didn't make a tidy roast or chop was too valuable to toss. It became sausage. Bits of muscle shaved from bones, fat trimmings, heads and hearts ground fine, spices to cover the edges, smoke to sell the story. Nothing wasted, everything sold. Newspapers were already grumbling. Sausage frauds, they called it when vendors stretched meat with stale bread or suspicious fillers. Warm summers without refrigeration turned carts into roulette wheels. People got sick. City boards scolded, then shrugged because the demand didn't slow. A salty, handheld meal for a nickel was hard to argue with when rent ate the rest of your pay envelope. The sausage took on an American job: feed the line. German butchers had guilds and rules. The American market had margins and crowds. Under price pressure, quality drifted. Meat got leaner at the butcher counter and fattier in the grinder. Spices got louder. Labels stayed quiet. You tasted garlic, smoke, pepper. You didn't taste sourcing. You weren't supposed to. Meanwhile, the cart had its own theater. A vendor in a bowler hat, steam flicking from a tin boiler, the sizzle of water on metal, the clang of tongs. He'd crack a bun, pull a sausage from the bath, swipe mustard, and slap it into your palm before your boss noticed you'd slipped out. It felt clean and hot and safe, even when it was. The show was part of the taste. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly scale would harden these habits. When railroads stitched cold cars to slaughterhouses, sausages could move farther and last longer. That helped the cart and the factory. It also spread the mystery. A frank bought in Boston might have started as a hog in Iowa, scraped into a barrel in Chicago, and blended with something from Nebraska, then rerouted by a broker with an eye on price, not provenance. Pure started showing up in advertisements long before it had a definition. Bakers slipped rice flour into bread, brewers watered beer, and sausage makers had their tricks. A sprinkle of potato starch here, a gulp of extra water there. If no one died, the city moved on. When someone did, there were editorials, and then again, silence. The pattern took root: scare, promise, forget, repeat. Here's a micro story. A newsboy in 1898 counts his coins, buys a franc, and bites in before it cools. He barely notices the grit, bone dust, maybe, or ground spice husk. He sells the final stack and doubles back for another. He'll remember the taste more than the queasy stomach he'll have later. The vendor will remember the rush more than the complaint he'll hear tomorrow. The factory foreman will only remember numbers. The craft divide widened. German-trained sausage makers complained about shortcuts and American-style blends, but on the street, speed set the standard. If your franc snapped and didn't burst, you were doing fine. If you could price it a cent lower, you were doing great. Quality took the hit. It would keep taking the hit. Meanwhile, the language of trust attached itself to ritual. Baseball parks discovered the perfect handoff: a hot franc and a cold drink passed down sticky rows. That association wasn't an accident. It grew from the same needs. Feeding thousands fast required products that behaved the same every time. A sausage that could sit hot and stable through the seventh inning needed help, ingredients, and process. The audience just tasted mustard and a win. Early spoilage scares pushed cities to tighten rules, then loosen them again when enforcement got expensive. Vendors learned routes to dodge inspectors. Packing houses learned which words to print and which to avoid. Frankfurter sounded continental, sausage sounded ordinary, mystery meat was for jokes and rival papers, but the mystery was real. You didn't know what was inside and you weren't meant to ask. Demand grew, and with it, new factories. Steam-powered grinders, brine pumps, and smokehouses stacked on the edge of stockyards, pushing product through by the ton. Sausage became the outlet for everything that didn't fetch a better price elsewhere. If a butcher shop couldn't sell a cut quickly, the grinder could. If an animal didn't look like the picture in a cookbook, it became links. Profit hid in the casing. There was one problem: as volume rose, consistency slipped. Some weeks the batch ran too lean and crumbled. Other weeks it burst in the kettle. Spices fluctuated, casings tore, and customers noticed. To restore order, factories leaned on two levers: process and additives. Both were still crude. Salting schedules, smoke density, ice usage. The canvas was there, but the paint needed chemistry. Public frustration simmered. A few reformers pushed for broader standards, lumping sausage with milk and medicine in the push against adulteration. But the political heat really rose only when writers dragged readers inside the plants. And once the door opened, everything changed. The cart didn't change much. The factory did. Another micro-story. A street vendor hears about a neighbor's customers falling sick and changes water twice as often. His profit drops, his line length doesn't. He adds a penny to the price and buyers argue, then pay. He learns the lesson industry would perfect. Raise trust, keep volume, don't explain too much. By the turn of the century, the path was set. Immigrant craft seeded the market, pushcarts trained a nation to love salt and speed, and factories learned to turn leftovers into units. A bun made it friendly. Steam made it safe, at least in spirit. The rest would come from lawmakers and lab coats. While that was happening in Chicago, New York's press found better stories in scandal than in recipes. Inspectors made headlines, fines made footnotes. The city's appetite rolled on. Sausages sizzled on corners and at fairs. Kids pointed. Parents nodded. No one read a label because there wasn't one to read. This was the moment everything was about to change, not because people stopped eating, but because someone forced them to look. A book would pry open the doors. A law would step in, not to perfect sausage, but to define the minimum. The carts would keep rolling. The factories would grow up. The recipe would move from guesswork to formula. Demand exploded. So did the factories behind it. And when eyes finally turned toward the vats and grinders, the industry found a new language to keep selling the same idea. The jungle opens the doors. To understand why the factory changed and the cart didn't, we need to step into a book that made readers gag over breakfast. In 1906, Upton Sinclair's novel Through opened the doors of Chicago's stockyards. He went in to expose labor misery and came out with a portrait of filth that stuck to the nation's tongue. Readers didn't debate literary style, they stared at their plates. Politicians felt the heat. Industry felt the target on its back. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The public reaction wasn't about empathy for workers, it was about fear of eating something rotten. The outrage moved faster than any inspector ever had. Letters flooded Washington. Newspaper cartoons drew rats on conveyor belts. Meanwhile, packing executives scrambled not to apologize but to calculate. If trust collapsed, sales collapsed. If rules came, better shape them than fight them. What followed were two quick laws: the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both passed in 1906. On paper, it looked like a cleansing: federal inspectors in plants, labels that meant something, penalties for fraud. In reality, these were minimums, not ideals. Inspectors checked live animals, carcasses, and visible conditions. They didn't reinvent recipes. They didn't outlaw scraps. They formalized them. This was the moment everything changed for sausage. Before, it was a convenient sink for trimmings. After the laws, it became a legitimized outlet. If a plant could demonstrate the meat wasn't diseased and the facility met basic standards, that meat could be chopped, salted, blended, and cased. The definition of meat still had room. The law didn't ban hearts or tongues. It didn't ban fat. It simply drew a line between edible and condemned. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Marketing men saw the opportunity in the new language. If the government had rules, brands could echo them. Pure didn't necessarily mean single muscle cuts. It could mean inspected. All meat could mean no cereal fillers, but it still left room for fats and less romantic parts. The words sounded reassuring. The content stayed economical. Factories adapted faster than critics expected. They cleaned the parts inspectors would see, organized lines that looked orderly from catwalks, and built documentation habits that turned process into paperwork. The grinder became less a blind spot and more a checkbox. Pass inspection, keep the margins, that was the goal. The recipe didn't need to be pretty if the label did the heavy lifting. One detail would prove crucial later: curing. Even before the laws, salt and smoke were common. Post-laws, sodium nitrite and later nitrite blends found their groove. Curing made sausage safer against botulism, brighter in color and longer lasting. That was a consumer win on the surface and a logistical win underneath. You could move product farther with less risk. A pink snap became the signal that things were fine, even if the definition of fine was mostly legal. Sinclair had one more unintended effect. He taught industry the value of the factory tour. If scandal came from mystery, then guided transparency could comment. Plants created windows, schedules, and talking points. Audiences saw white coats and stainless steel. They didn't see procurement spreadsheets or the variance in raw materials that recipes had to smooth over with salt and additives. Safety theater didn't start here, but it learned its cues. Back in Washington, regulators faced the same trade-offs the plants did. Make rules tight and you risk starving affordable supply. Make them loose and you risk public health and trust. They settled somewhere in the middle. Definitions of adulteration evolved. Misbranding carried penalties, but the system didn't require perfection. It codified adequacy. Consumers heard federal inspection and translated it as good. Industry heard it as predictable. Let's drop into a micro story. A senator tours a stockyard with reporters in tow. The plant has scrubbed floors, staged spotless aprons, and routed lines away from the noisiest renderers. At the end, a foreman hands the senator a hot frank from a spotless kettle. Cameras click. The senator bites, smiles, and calls it safe. He's not lying. He's just tasting the tip of a process built to be palatable on contact. Meanwhile, labels started to sing. Selected cuts, pure pork, government inspected, and the rising star, Frankfurter, with its old-world dignity. The irony was hard to miss to anyone inside the plant. The more variable the inputs, the more important the promise. Spices took on consistent ratios, grind sizes standardized. Salt levels rose to keep texture predictable. The romance shifted from butcher craft to brand trust. What nobody knew at the time was how the new rules would lock in an incentive. If you could pass inspection with cheaper raw materials and rely on curing and process to deliver stability, you'd do it. Sausage became the pressure valve for the carcass economy. The prime cuts went to the front of the house. Everything else met the emulsifier. The public repeated the label words and rarely asked what everything else meant. There was a legal dance around fillers. The Pure Food and Drug Act cracked down on undisclosed starches and water loading, but definitions allowed certain binders if declared, and processors learned to work the margins. Early prosecutions made examples. Quiet settlements made precedents. Through it all, one phrase held steady on posters and cartons: quality. It meant compliance, not excellence. In the aftermath of the initial fury, newspapers moved on to the next scandal. The stockyards got back to tempo. Workers still raced the clock. Inspectors carved their routines into muscle memory, and sausages rolled out by the boxcar, now certified, now branded, now wrapped in reassurance. The consumer experience changed very little. Steam, mustard, a bun, a bite. The difference lived in paperwork and chemistry. Industry learned its crisis playbook here. If a scare hit, invoke inspection. If a rumor spread, point to the federal stamp. Invite a reporter. Stage a tasting. Promise to cooperate. Then tweak the process just enough to avoid the next headline. The margins flowed from the same place, turn scraps into units and sell the feeling of safety. Now remember, the goal wasn't to deceive flat out. It was to operate within rules that allowed flexibility. That flexibility kept hot dogs cheap and available. It also kept the ingredient list elastic. Over time, as technology improved, the system would add two big tools: mechanical separation to unlock hard-to-reach meat, and a refined curing chemistry to keep color and flavor familiar. But the mindset was already set by 1906. Meet the minimum, polish the message. Here's where it gets clear. The jungle didn't invent regulation so much as it taught industry to survive it. Sausages didn't become boutique, they became standardized. The shopper didn't learn who raised the hog. They learned which brand made their favorite snap. Trust moved from butcher to logo. With rules in place and the dust settled, chemistry stepped in to smooth the rough edges. Color would signal safety, cure would battle microbes, and later, texturizers and emulsifiers would tame every batch into the same bite. The door was open, the playbook was written, and the pink would carry the promise forward. Chemistry of a hot dog, nitrates, color, and safety theater. To understand why a hot dog looks the way it does, start with a problem every sausage maker feared: botulism. In low-oxygen, moist sausages, the wrong bacteria can flourish. Sodium nitrite became the quiet guardian. A small dose pushes back against Clostridium botulinum, and at the same time it reacts with meat pigments to lock in that familiar cured pink and a subtle, tangy flavor. Safety, color, and taste, one ingredient working three jobs. Now remember, shoppers can't see microbes, but they can see color. Over time, that rosy hue turned into a shorthand for fresh and safe, even though it's really cured. Nitrite binds to myoglobin in the meat, forming compounds that survive cooking and keep the hot dog looking lively instead of gray. That visual cue does a lot of trust building at the shelf. A dull, brownish sausage might be perfectly fine, but it reads as tired. Pink says dependable. Here, S where it gets tricky. When nitrites meet high heat and certain amino acids, they can form nitrosamines, compounds linked to cancer risk in lab settings. That risk shaped policy. Regulators didn't toss curing out, they set limits and required safeguards. Processors added ascorbate or erythorbate, vitamin C relatives, to the mix because they inhibit nitrosamine formation during cooking. So the modern hot dog is a balancing act. Just enough nitrite to protect against botulism and deliver the cured character, plus an antioxidant buffer to keep the chemistry from going off script. Inside plants, nitrite use is measured in parts per million, and it's not a more is better situation. Too little and you risk safety and color instability. Too much and you blow past legal thresholds and invite harsher reactions in the cooker. The line workers do narrate the chemistry. They follow tight formulations. Batches are logged, brines are standardized, and color development is watched as closely as temperature curves. The pink isn't an accident, it's an outcome. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the labeling aisle. Consumers started side-eyeing sodium nitrite on ingredient panels, especially as health conversations heated up. Brands didn't want to lose the look or the protection, so a workaround gained steam: celery powder. Celery and certain other plants naturally contain nitrates. If you ferment that juice or powder, bacteria convert nitrates into nitrites. Add it to meat and you've delivered the same reactive molecule, nitrite, through a natural source. Labels shifted to no added nitrites or nitrates, with a footnote, except those naturally occurring in celery powder. The chemistry stayed, the phrasing softened. From a science perspective, the reaction pathway is similar. Nitrite meets myoglobin, forms nitric oxide, myoglobin sets the color. But from a marketing perspective, Uncured felt safer to shoppers even if the product still behaved like a cured meat. This is safety theater in label form. The process controls remain. The antioxidant buffers remain. The dose targets remain. Yet the word uncured suggests a gentler process. It's not a lie if the Code of Federal Regulations says using vegetable-derived nitrite allows that term. It's a linguistic pivot that keeps the pink and soothes concerns. Let's drop into a micro story. A brand manager sits with a color card deck comparing shades of pink under standardized lights. On the table beside it, 2 test logs. One batch uses direct nitrite, the other uses celery powder plus starter culture. The cards match. In the tasting room, the panel calls both classic. In the marketing meeting, only one earns the natural banner wrap. The decision isn't about taste, it's about the story. Back on the line, processors manage time as much as formula. Nitrite needs contact and the right conditions to fix the color. If the emulsion moves too quickly to the smokehouse, you get uneven hues. If the hold is too long, you push texture out of spec. There's a choreography: mix, chill, stuff, hold, heat, shower, chill again. Each stage protects against microbes while nurturing that pink signal. When it works, the package looks identical every week. Consistency is confident. Here, S where policy and perception diverge. Regulators focus on absolute safety. Preventing botulism is non-negotiable. Nitrosamine risk is managed through limits and additives. Epidemiology studies then look at population-level links between processed meats and cancer outcomes. Industry responds by tightening controls, lower target nitrite levels, mandatory ascorbate, careful cook profiles. The store shelf displays none of that complexity. Instead, the front label lifts a simple promise: no artificial preservatives. And the back label tells a quieter truth inside the fine print. Consumers, for the most part, taste smoke and texture and move on with their day. But the chemistry sits under every bite. Nitrite nudges flavor toward the cured family. Think ham-like notes, a slight mineral brightness. Without it, you'd get a paler, meatier, less signature hot dog. Some niche makers do that, leaning into fresh sausage vibes. It rarely scales because the rest of the system, distribution, shelf life, shopper expectations, leans hard on cured stability. Another micro story. A school district nutrition director fields parent emails about nitrites in lunches. Procurement options are a riddle. The Uncured brand costs more, still uses celery powder, and passes bid rules with reassuring language. The Direct Nitrite brand costs less and meets all federal safety standards. The director picks the Uncured label to calm the noise. The cafeteria trays look the same. The inbox gets quieter. What nobody knew at the time natural cues took off was that the nitrite conversation would keep looping back to color. Brands tried subtle shifts, more smoked notes, different spice blends, but whenever the pink turned dull, sales dipped. That taught a lesson. You can negotiate words, but you can't negotiate the shopper's eyes. The hue is a promise. Break it, and you lose a Saturday cookout. There's a second piece to the safety theater. The cook. Companies tout fully cooked for safety, which is true. Hot dogs are pasteurized in the plant, but then advise reheating at home. Why? Because post-cook contamination is a real risk in any ready-to-eat meat. The plant mitigates with sanitation and sealed packaging. The reheating advice is a belt and suspenders move. Again, you're seeing the choreography. Chemistry plus heat plus handling, all aimed at keeping invisible dangers away while the visible color says, relax. Meanwhile, international debates simmer. Some countries push for nitrite reductions in cured meats, arguing for lower allowable levels or alternatives. Industry counters with botulism risk and consumer acceptance. Trials explore plant extracts, different packaging atmospheres, and slower distribution. Some changes take hold. Many hit the wall of cost or taste. It turns out the triplet, safety, color, flavor, resists easy substitutions at scale. Let's be clear, nitrite isn't a villain or a savior. It's a tool. In the early days, it made mass sausage less dangerous. Later, it became the aesthetic and flavor anchor that shaped the modern hot dog. The controversy comes from how we talk about it. When labels use terms that imply absence while delivering function, trust gets fuzzy. When brands lean on color to sell safety, the theater lights up. And yet the product endures because the system holds. Precise dosing, antioxidant buffers, managed heat, and a pink that reads as right. Safety sold the color. Next, texture and yield would sell the bite. Mechanically separated meat, the slurry that built an empire. By the time color and cure had the pink locked in, plants still faced a simple math problem. Too much edible tissue clung stubbornly to bones. Knives could only get so close. That leftover meat was margin sitting just out of reach. Mechanical separation turned it into product. Here's the stakes. In a business where pennies per pound decide bonuses, recovering a few extra percentage points of meat from carcasses scales to millions. For consumers, it meant cheaper hot dogs that behaved the same every Saturday. For workers, it meant faster lines and fewer pauses to trim by hand. For the industry, it meant a paste that could swallow variance and spit out consistency. So what actually happened? In the 1960s, purpose-built machines arrived that didn't slice, they squeezed. Bones and attached scraps went into a hopper. Under high pressure, the mass met a perforated screen or auger. Soft tissues, tiny muscle fibers, fat connective proteins flowed through. Hard materials, bone, large cartilage, stayed behind. The output wasn't ground like burger. It was a smooth slurry, a uniform emulsion base ready to season, cure, and stuff. This was mechanically separated meat, MSM. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the accounting side. Once you had a stream of MSM, you could design hot dogs around it. No more gambling on tomorrow's trim mix. Instead, you blended MSM with intentional fat levels, salt to extract proteins, and water or ice to control temperature and texture. Smoke, flavor, and spices brought the profile back into the familiar lane. The eater didn't meet a bone, they met a uniform bite. The immediate impact was scale. Plants could run harder with fewer knife stations and less skilled trimming. Yield climbed, inventory planning simplified. A pound of bones became ounces of sellable paste. That efficiency didn't just pad margins, it set a new baseline. Competitors without MSM capacity were suddenly too expensive or too inconsistent. The slurry changed the floor of the market. There was a catch: texture. Traditional grinding leaves muscle fibers relatively intact. MSM shears them smaller, and the slurry includes more connective proteins. That's why the process leaned on salt, phosphates, and mixing energy to build a stable protein network, trapping fat and water so the hot dog sliced clean, snapped lightly, and didn't weep in the package. If you've ever wondered why one brand bleeds water in a cold skillet and another stays tight, the emulsion build is the reason. Here's a micro story. A plant manager watches the pressure gauge on a separator creep up. Bones are going in faster than spec. The output thickens. Downstream, the mixer operator compensates, bumps salt by a fraction, adds a touch more ice. The batch holds. Later, the quality tech logs the day, variance absorbed, texture on target. No consumer notices. The system did its job. Regulators noticed too. Not all MSM is equal. Poultry MSM, because of bone structure and microbial profiles, found broad acceptance for cooked products. Beef MSM raised more red flags, prompting tighter restrictions and eventually sharp limits in some categories. The headline didn't say paste banned. It said, in effect, use the right paste in the right places, meet microbiological and composition standards, and tell us what it is. Plants adjusted. Chicken and turkey, MSM, became the workhorses for value franks. Beef lines leaned more on traditional trimmings or different recovery methods. Public perception lagged behind the nuance. When pink slime became a household phrase years later, technically a different process used for lean beef trimmings, the recoil splashed onto anything that looked like a slurry. MSM became a villain in comment sections, regardless of its actual control. Industry responded with familiar moves. Factory tours showing stainless tanks, charts promising safety, labels emphasizing all beef or no mechanically separated beef, even when poultry MSM carried the load elsewhere in the portfolio. Efficiency rebranded as stewardship. We use the whole bird, reducing waste. Let's talk action on the line. MSM doesn't go straight to casings. It meets salt, sometimes phosphates, and cold. The mixing extracts myofibrillar proteins, the glue that binds the emulsion. Fat gets dispersed into tiny droplets, stabilized by that protein matrix. Add water wisely and you increase yield without turning the bite mushy. Overmix and you shear the network into paste that can't hold itself. Undermix and fat smears, causing defect. The sausage maker's art moved from knife skills to rheology, feel and flow. The impact was profound. Once MSM-based formulations proved they could deliver a consistent bite at a low cost, the market stratified. Budget hot dogs leaned hard into MSM blends. Mid-tier played with ratios, chasing a meteor chew. Premium lines bragged about no MSM or only whole muscle trimmings, priced accordingly. All three tiers used similar smoke profiles and curing chemistry. The differentiation lived in mouthfeel and story. Meanwhile, MSM opened the door to finer control over micron-scale texture. By dialing grind size on non-MSM components and mixing speeds, you could hide gristle and eliminate the occasional chewy surprise that turned consumers off. The uniform matrix wasn't an accident, it was the point. Parents bought what kids wouldn't spit out. Ketchup covered the rest. Let's not skip the safety lens. MSM increases surface area and blends tissues, which can raise microbial stakes if controls slip. Plants countered with strict temperature regimes, everything near freezing during mix and stuff, plus cook steps that pasteurized the core. Post-cook handling had to be spotless to avoid contamination. If you've ever seen a line shut down to resanitize a blade guide, that's the post-cook paranoia at work. Any lapse and the recall letter writes itself. What nobody outside the plant saw was how MSM stabilized supply chains. When boneless trim quality swung with seasons or herd sizes, MSM smoothed the curve. Contracts reflected throughput, not just carcass grades. Private labels could copycat national brands because the input spec was less about art and more about flow. The slurry democratized the hot dog. There was one more wrinkle: casings. A uniform paste flows beautifully into cellulose casings that get peeled post-cook for the classic smooth-skinned dog. Natural casings, prized for nostalgic snap, can handle MSM blends too, but the line slows for variability. Mass-market brands chose speed. The peel-and-pack look became the American default. If you wanted the old-world bite, you paid more and forgave the occasional twist or curve. Another micro-story. A ballpark concession buyer tests 2 dogs in the off-season. Sample A, MSM forward, grills fast, holds well, and costs pennies less per link. Sample B, chunkier, tastes great fresh, but splits after an hour in the warmer. The stadium picks A. Every fan on opening day thinks they're tasting tradition. Their tasting stability built by pressure and protein networks. The backlash cycles never fully stop. A TV segment shows slow-motion shots of pink paste and sales dip for a quarter. Brands respond by launching simple recipe lines, then quietly keep MSM in value SKUs that anchor volume. Over time, consumers sort themselves. Some chase labels, most chase price and habit. At cookouts, nobody debates recovery methods. They argue over mustard versus relish. Here's the quiet truth: MSM wasn't a corner cut, it was an engineering fix to a waste problem under mass production. It turned loss into inventory, then into the smooth chew that defined a generation's idea of a hot dog. Efficiency did the unglamorous work. Marketing handled the smile. Now you've got paste, predictable and cheap, ready to take on flavor and shape. The next move is where the emulsion earns its name. Add binders, hold water, and stretch every pound without breaking the bite. Fillers, binders, and the emulsion illusion. Now you've got paste, but paste alone won't pay the bills. The trick is to hold water, lock fat in place, and keep that bite springy. That's where fillers and binders earn their quiet glory. They don't just stretch a pound, they stabilize chaos so every slice looks clean and every kid-friendly chew lands the same. Here's the stakes. Water is the cheapest ingredient in a hot dog, but water doesn't behave unless you give it a place to stay. If it weeps into the package, shoppers think cheap. If it explodes as steam in the cooker, casings split and lines slow. Bind it properly, and you turn $1 of meat into more servings without tipping taste into spongy. That balance is the profit zone. So what actually happens? Start with salt. Salt isn't just flavor, it's a solvent for myofibrillar proteins like myosin. As the mixer churns that MSM-based slurry with salt, those proteins dissolve and become sticky, the natural glue that holds fat droplets in a stable emulsion. But salt alone can't do the whole job at high yields. That's where phosphates step in. They raise pH slightly, increasing water-holding capacity and helping proteins extract and unfold. The network swells, traps more moisture, and resists heat shock in the smokehouse. Meanwhile, processors reach for starches, potato, tapioca, corn, or milk powders and soy protein isolates. These are the quiet sponges. They bind free water, fill microscopic gaps in the protein matrix, and reduce purge in the package. Used well, they're invisible. Used poorly, they turn the bite pasty with a dull collapse instead of a spring. The game is dosage and distribution. Every plant has a threshold chart. Add enough to boost yield and slice integrity. Stop before your dog tastes like a noodle. Let's drop into a micro story. A formulation scientist stands over a bench mixer with 2 pilot batches. Batch A uses 1.5% potato starch. Batch B uses 2.2% plus a touch of milk protein. After cook, a slice is neat but sheds a ring of juice under vacuum. B slice is cleaner, no puddle, but the bite feels a hint rubbery. In the tasting panel, 3 people vote for B's aesthetics, 2 grumble about texture. The boss circles a third option, split the difference and nudge phosphate up a hair. The spreadsheet smiles. Flavor has guardrails too. You think hot dog, and your brain expects smoke, garlic, a little coriander, maybe a sweet spice like mace. Companies build flavor systems like puzzles. Liquid smoke for consistency, essential oils for lift, ground spices for warmth. MSG or yeast extract fills the mid-palate so the salt doesn't have to do all the work. The illusion is that meat alone provides the roundness. In truth, the recipe writes the memory. Casings define the first impression. Natural casings, cleaned intestines, bring that nostalgic snap, a thin burst before your teeth meet the emulsion. They vary by diameter and toughness, and they slow the line. Cellulose casings peel after cooking, leaving a perfectly smooth, uniform surface that runs fast and photographs well. Collagen casings straddle the middle. Plants choose based on volume and the story the brand wants to tell. Old world snap costs time. Smooth and shiny pays dividends in speed. Here's an action beat from the floor. The stuffer head hums as ropes of emulsion glide into cellulose. The line leader checks fill pressure to avoid voids. A few links later, the rope hits the smokehouse rack and begins its arc through color fix, heat set, and shower chill. If the emulsion is balanced, proteins extracted, phosphates dialed, starch hydrated, the links come out taut and glossy. If not, you'll see fat out, blisters, or split ends. Those defects turn into rework and lost hours. The binder system decides whether a day ends smooth or with a meeting. Impact arrives in the slicer. Watch a value-packed dog cut cleanly at high speed with no smear, and you're seeing the emulsion illusion succeed. It looks like meat because the matrix holds. It's more like a custard reinforced with muscle glue, but it eats like a memory your brain already trusts. That's the magic trick. Redefine texture expectations until they feel like authenticity. Meanwhile, labels negotiate the truth. All beef means the animal source is bovine, but it doesn't promise prime steak ground into links. It can still include beef fat, beef trimmings, protein isolates derived from beef. Meat franks invite pork or poultry into the party, usually where MSM and binders do heavy lifting. Standards of identity set ceilings and floors, how much moisture, how much fat, what counts as meat, what must be named. Within that frame, there's wiggle room. Starch might be capped, protein isolates might need a call-out. Skilled formulators color within the lines and still paint whatever picture the brand wants on the front. Another micro-story. Procurement manager stares at commodity screens. Soy isolate down 2 cents, non-fat dry milk up, potato starch steady. She emails R&D, can we tilt toward soy this quarter without triggering allergen flags in school bids? Answer, yes, but update the spec language and print run. The dog will taste the same. The ingredient deck will list a different helper. Parents won't notice unless they read closely. Phosphates deserve their own beat. They're not just moisture boosters, they're structure managers. By chelating ions and shifting pH, they let myosin swell and rebind under heat. That's why the snap can be engineered. Without them, you can still get a good bite, but your process window narrows. Overcook a non-phosphate dog by a few degrees and it dries or bursts. With phosphates, you've got guardrails. That means fewer line stoppages and better yield. Some brands now push no phosphates for a cleaner label, compensating with higher protein extraction, stricter temperatures, and more expensive cuts. It works, but costs climb and margins feel it. Water deserves a human moment. A veteran mixer operator runs a hand across the emulsion surface, silky, cold, cohesive. He adds ice not just to hit formula, but to keep the mix under 40 degrees where fat stays discreet. Too warm and fat smears into the protein, weakening the net. Too cold and binders won't hydrate. He can hear the change in the paddle's pitch when the proteins extract right. That sound keeps recalls away more than any slogan. Flavor rounding isn't only about spices. Sugar, dextrose, or corn syrup solids softens sharp salt notes and helps browning where brands want grill marks. Liquid smoke carries phenols that taste like thyme in a pit without bottlenecking the smokehouse. Garlic oil stays consistent when last year's crop runs hot. Coriander and white pepper give the whisper your brain calls classic. If a batch tastes flat, the fix might be a quarter gram of MSG, not a new cow. Let's talk impact on consumers. Fillers and binders keep price points friendly. A family can buy a pack and feed a game night without thinking twice. The dog that works for kids, no gristle, mild spice, easy chew, wins shelf space. The illusion isn't malicious, it's a system meeting a brief, cheap, stable, familiar. The risk is when the ingredient list starts hiding in euphemisms while front labels promise simplicity. Trust lives or dies on that gap. Meanwhile, premium dogs lean into fewer helpers. They claim no starch, no added phosphates, no MSG, and they often deliver a meatier chew. But they still rely on protein extraction and controlled water. They still use salts and cure. The difference is a tighter window and a price that covers the misses. If a batch splits, they eat the loss instead of emulsifying harder. One more micro story. A startup launches a 3-ingredient, frank, beef, water, salt. First production run tastes good hot but gets rubbery cold with purge pooling in the pack. Second run adds a touch of ascorbate and bumps mix time. Stability improves. Third run quietly introduces beef collagen to help bind. The label still reads clean. The margin gets a little healthier. In the end, fillers, binders, and flavor systems don't just stretch meat. They create the illusion of simplicity out of a very managed process. Texture is engineered, not inherited. The snap is tuned, not guaranteed. And the bite you remember from ball games was built by starch granules and protein networks as much as by smoke and salt. Texture solved, flavor dialed. Now they had to win hearts. Marketing the innocence. Baseball, July 4th, and the American kid. While factories perfected pink and bite, the sale happened somewhere else, in American rituals. Ballparks stitched hot dogs to patriotism, one inning at a time. Vendors wove through aisles with tin boxes and steam, trading a wrapped link for a shout and $1. A win tasted like mustard. A loss tasted like mustard. Either way, the dog was the constant. Teams figured out early that a stadium needed a food that could move fast, hold heat, and feel celebratory. Hot dogs became the soundtrack between pitches. Here's the stakes. You don't build a national habit in the plant. You build it where people feel something. Baseball gave hot dogs a backdrop of belonging. Fathers teaching scorecards, kids waving foam fingers, radio crackling in the car ride home. July 4th sealed it. Fireworks, parades, backyard grills, paper plates bending under chips and ketchup. Wrap that scene around a sausage, and worries about fillers and nitrites fade into the smoke. The product sold itself by hiding inside memory. Action looked like this, brands linked with teams and parks trading signage for exclusivity. The official hot dog wasn't just a contract, it was a billboard you could eat. On the concourse, mascots danced with foot-long props. On the scoreboard, trivia breaks ended with coupons. Meanwhile, grocers built end caps with bun towers and flag bunting. You didn't need to read a label, you needed to plan a party. A 2-for-1 deal did more than an ingredient panel ever could. Impact was clear by mid-century. The phrase ballpark frank stopped being a descriptor and became a promise. It meant a certain salt level, a smoke cue you could spot from a parking lot, and a texture that didn't fight back. When TV spread baseball into living rooms, commercials delivered jingles that welded product to childhood. Cartoons gave hot dogs eyes and smiles. The sausage became a buddy. Fun transferred into trust. Meanwhile, nickel francs taught price expectations. Early price wars on city corners carried over to grocers. Even as costs climbed, brands fought to keep the entry pack cheap. That's how the cheap treat identity calcified. It was the weeknight save when the paycheck ran thin, the reward after mowing the lawn, the bribe that got a toddler into a car seat. Value meant forgiveness. Consumers accepted a longer ingredient list if the receipt stayed friendly. Suburban growth multiplied the effect. Backyard grills standardized the ritual: a bag of charcoal, a pack of dogs, a V-shaped tray for buns. Retailers sold entire summers on aisle 3: ketchup, relish, disposable plates, patriotic napkins. A hot dog wasn't a protein, it was a kit. And the engineering that made links heat stable and forgiving on a grill reduced failure at home. Burn one side, the snap survived. Forget the tongs, still edible. The product helped consumers succeed at being hosts. Marketing leaned into innocence. Jingles turned ingredients into a chorus. Kids' cartoons tucked hot dogs into lunchbox dreams. Packaging borrowed school bus yellow and playground reds. When a recall hit the news, listeria in a plant, a line shut down. Brands went to work with the crisis playbook honed decades earlier. Executives toured facilities with cameras rolling. Ads shifted for a quarter toward quality you can trust, showing close-ups of whole muscle trim going into a grinder, even if most production didn't look like that every day. Reassurance tour quietly replaced transparency. Just enough stainless steel to calm, not enough detail to complicate. Micro-story, a 1980s Saturday morning in a living room. A child watches a cartoon where a hot dog defeats a villain with a mustard lasso. The ad that follows sings a jingle about the kid-approved taste. In the afternoon, that family buys the brand they just saw because the tune stuck and the price matched the circular. The kid bites, nods, and asks for another. That nod is the ROI. Brands also borrowed institutions. July 4th contests turned consumption into spectacle, making news that doubled as ad space. The message wasn't ingredients you can pronounce, it was fun you can watch. Back-to-school season pitched hot dogs as lunchbox heroes, safe, cold, or warm, cut into coins for small hands. Halloween packs put bats on labels and leaned into quick dinner before trick-or-treating. If there was a calendar square with emotion, there was a hot dog tie-in. Here, S where the ledger whispered under the choir. Mass market adoption lowered the cost to acquire the next generation of customers. Once a child internalized hot dog equals celebration, the brand didn't have to fight as hard on facts. They sold the event. Parents stretched for time, reached for the reliable peace treaty. The ingredient deck learned to play second fiddle. Language softened. No artificial flavors took the spotlight while celery powder handled the cure backstage. Safety theater on labels met innocence theater on TV. Crisis management matured. A contamination scare. The press release hit with out of an abundance of caution. Refunds flowed. A spokesperson in a white coat showed up on morning shows explaining cook temperatures and sanitation protocols. Then quietly, the media buy shifted toward family-owned scents and our commitment to quality, with throwback footage of hand-linking in sepia tones. Nostalgia reset the mood. The ledger liked how fast memory worked when given the right cue. Ballparks taught one more lesson. Environment controls taste. With crowd noise and sunshine, salt reads lower and smoke reads higher. Brands tuned formulas for stadiums, then translated those cues into retail SKUs labeled stadium style. Consumers believed they were bringing the park home. They were bringing a slightly bolder smoke and a salt curve that hit the same dopamine switch. Ritual did the rest. Another micro-story, a Little League concession stand. A volunteer mom juggles cash, grills, and a cooler of buns. The supplier delivered a case of dogs that hold well under a heat lamp and don't wrinkle fast. Kids swarm after the last out, faces dusty, uniforms stained. Every sale funds new helmets. Parents buy two because the line is moving and the price is right. No one debates phosphates, they debate ketchup on a dog. The brand cemented loyalty by making the volunteers' job easy. As suburbs grew into exurbs, warehouse clubs stacked pallets of party packs with a bonus sleeve of buns. The implied promise, you're the kind of person who hosts. The hidden pitch, you can feed a crowd without cooking school. That's how hot dogs slid into every graduation open house, pool party, and cul-de-sac block night. Marketing only had to nudge. The product's ease did the rest. When competitors crowded the shelf, labels turned to flags. All beef, stadium style, natural, no fillers. Some claims spoke to process, others spoke to pride. The average shopper navigated by price and familiarity. The jingle they knew, the mascot they laughed at as a kid, the ad with the backyard that looked like theirs. It's hard to argue with a memory when it shows up on sale. Through it all, one idea pulsed: make hot dogs the harmless part of a good day. If they're a villain in a documentary, they're a hero at a birthday party. Marketing didn't have to erase chemistry. It had to drown it out with marching bands and summer dusk. While ads sang, the ledger drove decisions. The story made demand predictable. The factory made supply obedient. And the money met in the middle, in a bun held by a kid whose grin sold the next pack without a single footnote. The economics of scraps. Why the scam endured. Follow the money and the pink paste starts to make perfect sense. A hot dog is an answer to a math problem. How do you turn parts with low resale value into a product people buy by the millions, week after week, without flinching? The solution isn't just recipe. It's a system that turns byproducts into profit, then protects that machine from shocks. Here's the stakes. If scraps stay scraps, margins sag and waste climbs. If scraps become units, packaged, shelf-stable, and branded, every animal yields more revenue. For families, this translates into a low price that keeps hot dogs on the list. For companies, it stabilizes earnings. For regulators and health advocates, it creates a puzzle. The more efficient the system, the more incentive there is to normalize the product and soften scrutiny. Action starts at the slaughter floor and ends in the spice room, but the real engine is vertical integration. When one corporate umbrella owns slaughter, trimming, rendering MSM lines, spice blending, casing supply, smoke compound purchasing, packaging film, and distribution, costs get locked down at every step. Internal transfer prices smooth volatility. Trimmings that might fetch a thin price on the open market flow at book cost into emulsion. The result? A finished hot dog that's cheaper to make than a burger of the same weight and far more predictable. Impact shows up on shelves and in financial reports. A value pack priced to move anchors the category. Premium lines sit higher, using the same plants and many of the same processes, but with tweaks and a better story. Private label acts as a pressure valve. If a national brand wants to hold list price, the plant keeps capacity full by running store brand franks on the night shift. The inputs are often near identical, the labels different. The brand captures margin on one line and volume on the other. Meanwhile, commodity dynamics shape the week-to-week. When pork fat dips, formulations lean into it. When soy isolate trends down, binders shift. Procurement plays the board like a chess game, swapping pieces without changing the flavor target. The eater experiences classic. The spreadsheet experiences basis points of savings. That's why the scam, if you want to call it that, endures. The product is designed to absorb volatility invisibly and keep price satisfaction high. Let's drop into a micro story. Procurement VP scans a dashboard at 6 a.m. Trim prices up, freight tight, spice supplier offering a 1/4-cent discount for a 2-year contract. She signs the spice deal, tilts a formulation from milk powder to soy to avoid dairy inflation, and instructs sales to hold promo pricing through the holiday. The shopper sees a patriotic end cap and a familiar price. The quarter's margin pops by a hair. No ad mentions the swap. No one's palate flags it. Lobbying fits neatly into this economics. Standards of identity, the rules that define meat, set moisture and fat caps and govern terms like uncured, are the fence line around profitability. If that fence is drawn with a little give, innovation can keep yield high. Trade groups nudge agencies and legislators toward modernization, arguing for flexibility, label harmonization, and science-based updates. The public hears clarity. The balance sheet hears room to maneuver. Definitions stretch with language. All beef signals animal source, not cut quality. Natural flavor can hide a blend of spice extracts and smoke fractions that deliver a consistent profile cheaper than whole spices. No added nitrites makes an exception for celery powder in a footnote. Each phrasing preserves consumer comfort while protecting the process. It's not an outright lie, it's a story told in regulatory dialect. Private label versus national brand creates another cushion. Retailers pressure manufacturers for lower costs, but they also need a category leader to anchor expectations. The national brand spends on marketing, normalizes the product, and sets the taste benchmark. The store brand rides that wake, cheaper by a few cents, stealing share from shoppers who value price over jingles. Plants like both customers. One buys ad-driven volume at higher margin. The other fills downtime and keeps lines warm. Consumers, for their part, make a trade that the industry banks on, salt-fat pleasure for price and convenience. On a Tuesday after a long shift, a 5-minute meal beats a label seminar. At a birthday party, a dozen kids need food that won't spark complaints. Nostalgia smooths the edges. If grandpa ate them at a double-header, they feel harmless by association. That's the emotional arbitrage the system cashes in on. Now remember, not every dial is under industry control. Health science and regulators press from the other side. When studies link processed meat to elevated cancer risk, companies move fast to lower nitrite targets, boost ascorbate, and polish labels. The economics don't break, they flex. Reformulation costs money, but volume defrays it, and cleaner claims can command a small premium. The portfolio absorbs the hit by pushing value packs, where elasticity matters, and premium SKUs where margin hides. Here's an action beat you won't see in ads. A finance team runs a scenario. New school lunch rules cap sodium and restrict certain additives. That threatens a bid worth millions. R&D proposes a lower salt emulsion with more umami boosters, new thermal profiles, and tighter chill controls to maintain texture. Procurement lines up a celery powder supplier that guarantees consistent nitrate content. Legal drafts language to keep Uncured alive. The bid lands. Lunch trays look the same. The spreadsheet stays green. Impact ripples beyond the plant. Logistics schedules night runs to keep product cold and trucks full, shaving cents per mile. Packaging engineers cut microns from film without risking punctures, saving pennies per pack that add up across millions of units. Energy managers shift smokehouse loads to off-peak hours. Waste from one step becomes input for another. Casings trimmed for pet food, steam captured for preheat. Efficiency becomes identity. We respect the animal doubles as we use every billable ounce. Lobby pressure also aims at litigation risk. Class actions over uncured phrasing or natural claims end in settlements and label updates rather than fundamental process changes. The playbook: deny wrongdoing, agree to clearer wording, maybe issue coupons. Consumers get a nudge toward transparency. The core economics remain intact. Cheaper sources stay cheaper. The emulsion keeps its shape. Another micro story. A retailer's buyer negotiates annual terms. She wants a nickel off per pack and a co-op ad budget for summer. The brand counters, 3 cents off an end cap placement during July. Deal. That end cap drives lift across the aisle, buns, condiments, chips. The whole basket profitability justifies a price hold on the frank itself. The hot dog is the lead-in to a margin ecosystem. Why does the scam endure? Because it isn't one trick, it's a mesh. Scraps become a sellable matrix. Chemistry locks safety and appearance. Marketing sews the product into memory. And economics keep the whole thing cheap enough to be thoughtless. Any single pressure, health headlines, a recall, a price spike meets a cushion. The system rebalances, often invisibly, to keep the core promise alive. A familiar bite at a friendly price. What would actually break it? A combination of forces. Stricter standards that narrow ingredient wiggle room, procurement transparency that exposes inputs, and consumer shifts that reward meat priced like meat instead of like nostalgia. But those push against decades of habit and a lot of Saturday afternoon. Pressure from health science and regulators does start to bite, though. Costs inch up as formulas adjust. Labels lose a few comforting phrases. Some buyers step up to premium lines or step out entirely. Still, the grill lights on July 4th. Volume absorbs reformulation, the line hums, and the economics of scraps keep turning leftovers into the taste of a good day. Health alarms, class actions, and the WHO bombshell. The first tremor hit before the bombshell. Researchers kept seeing a pattern. People who ate more processed meat tended to have higher rates of certain cancers, especially colorectal. It wasn't a single smoking gun, it was a stack of studies pointing in the same direction. Industry pushed back with questions about confounders. People who eat more hot dogs might also smoke more, exercise less. Scientists adjusted, ran more models, and the signal didn't disappear. Then the headline arrived. An international cancer research agency reviewed the evidence and classified processed meat as a carcinogen, putting it in the same risk category as other known causes. not because a hot dog equals a cigarette, but because the evidence linking it to cancer existed with enough strength to act. The nuance got flattened in the media. Parents read cancer and stared at lunchboxes. Brands watched search spikes and braced for impact. Here's the stakes. For families, it raised a daily calculus, the convenience and nostalgia versus potential long-term risk. For schools and hospitals, it choked procurement meetings with debates over nitrites, sodium, and alternatives that kids would actually eat. For companies, the risk wasn't just sales. It was lawsuits, label scrutiny, and the possibility that regulators would tighten definitions that had been flexible for decades. Action unfolded fast. Trade groups argued context. Absolute risk remained modest at typical intakes, and safe handling standards made today's Franks different from a century ago. Public health voices countered with a simple message: limit frequency, diversify proteins, watch the portion sizes. Meanwhile, nutrition researchers explain the difference between hazard and dose. The hazard exists. Your risk changes with how much and how often. The average viewer just heard the word that sticks: carcinogen. In cafeterias, the effect was immediate. Some districts pulled hot dogs from regular rotation. Others kept them with new rules. Uncured labels, lower sodium options, smaller links. Purchasing managers called vendors, asking for assurances and cleaner ingredient decks. The answer was ready. No added nitrites via celery powder, antioxidants in the mix, lower nitrite targets overall, tighter thermal curves to control nitrosamine. It wasn't a reinvention. It was a recalibration and a rewording. Class actions arrived on a parallel track. Lawyers targeted phrases like uncured and no nitrites added, arguing that using celery powder to deliver nitrates that convert to nitrite misled consumers. The cases didn't claim acute harm, they alleged deception. Settlements often followed a pattern. Companies denied wrongdoing, paid modest amounts or coupons, and updated labels to clarify the vegetable-derived sources. For industry, this was manageable. The cure chemistry stayed. The footnote grew longer. Meanwhile, epidemiology continued to paint in shades. Processed meat consumption correlated with higher colorectal cancer risk, but the relative increases were small against the baseline for many individuals. Public health agencies nudged, not banned, advising moderation. Nutritionists emphasized the wider diet, fiber intake, overall pattern, lifestyle factors. Still, the narrative weight fell on the hot dog. It's an easy symbol, so it carries more blame than a mixed deli platter. Inside plants, reformulations accelerated. Sodium levels tightened to meet new school standards and consumer targets. Ascorbate use became universal guardrail. Smokehouse profiles shifted to avoid overbrowning, lowering nitrosamine opportunities. Some lines trialed alternative cure systems or reduced nitrite to the lowest functional levels, accepting paler color as a trade in niche SKUs. Quality teams added more frequent residual tests and color check. Safety theater leaned on real controls. Let's drop into a micro story. A brand's R&D head gets a call from legal, a suit filed over natural claims. The team meets that afternoon. Decision: keep the celery powder, change front panel language to no synthetic nitrites, add a clear asterisk, except those naturally occurring in cultured celery. Launch a PR note about transparency. Consumers see a familiar pink and a calmer phrase. Sales dip for a week, then recover. School lunch became a battleground of compromises. Bid specs began to require no artificial preservatives, pushing vendors toward vegetable-derived cures. Sodium caps forced flavor tweaks, more garlic, yeast extract, a touch of sugar to balance. Links got smaller to meet calorie targets. Kids still ate them, especially on fun day menus. Nutrition directors kept their phones quieter by posting ingredient lists online and adding fruit cups to the tray. Hot dogs survived by fitting a new box. Another front opened with heart health groups. Sodium and saturated fat put hot dogs in the caution zone, even if you shelved the cancer debate. Brands responded with lean lines using turkey and chicken, sometimes lower in fat but still dependent on the same emulsion trickery. The pink stayed. The bite stayed. The numbers on the nutrition facts nudged downward, and that was enough for a light label. The media cycle made an unmade panic. A morning show ran a segment comparing hot dogs to cigarettes. Nutritionists pushed back live, clarifying that categories don't equal magnitude. The correction landed softer than the scare. Brands bought ad spots later that week showing family cookouts and a once-in-a-while message, repositioning the dog as an occasional treat instead of a daily staple. That reframing let them keep volume steady. People weren't eating hot dogs daily anyway. They were episodic indulgences. Class actions didn't stop at Uncured. All natural, no fillers, and all beef claims face scrutiny when ingredient lists included isolates, broth, or ambiguous natural flavors. Settlement squeezed adjectives, not emulsions. Marketing teams got savvier with words that tested well and survived legal review. Simple, real ingredients, crafted. The product inside the casing stayed on its rails. Salt, cure, emulsion, flavor system. Let's be clear about the consumer impact. The WHO IARC classification gave people a reason to pause, maybe buy less often, maybe pick a cleaner label. But July 4th still came. Ballgames still sold footlongs. Parent life still demanded fast wins. People adjusted by reframing frequency. Hot dogs became more of a weekend thing, less of a weeknight staple in some households. Others didn't change at all. The category bent without breaking. Industry leaned into data. They funded studies on nitrite reduction, alternative antioxidants, and packaging atmospheres that slow spoilage at lower cure levels. Some advances stuck: lower residual nitrite without color loss, better control of cook temps, improved sanitation that reduced post-cook risks. These weren't PR stunts, they were incremental engineering. The story outside the plant stayed polarized. The work inside got nerdier and more precise. Micro-story, a recall day panic. A test flags listeria in post-cook equipment. The line stops. Corporate calls for a voluntary recall out of caution. News hits. 2 weeks later, the plant reopens with stricter swabbing, redesigned drains, and a video of the CEO in a hairnet. The label doesn't change. The trust bank refills on the back of process, not poetry. The bigger shift came in the portfolio. Brands added grass-fed beef franks, heritage pork, organic uncured, and no phosphates lines to catch the worried shopper, even if those SKUs represented a thin slice of volume. They sat eye level, priced higher with rustic fonts. Value packs stayed low and moved by the pallet. The company sold both stories, cushioning risk across demographics. What nobody outside the finance room saw: reformulation costs were real but amortized across massive runs. A fraction of a cent per link could still sting when multiplied by millions, but efficiencies elsewhere, packaging tweaks, logistics absorbed the hit. The lesson held: respond enough to reduce heat, avoid overhauls that break the core economics. In the end, the WHO bombshell didn't end the hot dog. It clarified the terms. Eat less often, favor variety, read the fine print if you care about cure. The industry adapted with labels and labs, not confessionals. For viewers keeping score, the alarms mattered because they forced the machine to show its workings. As big brands pivoted, a new story tried to overwrite the old one: natural, uncured, crafted, even while the engine under the hood ran on the same principle. The clean label pivot: natural, uncured, and artisan theater. The pivot started with a word problem no spreadsheet could ignore. Consumers were reading labels. Sodium nitrite triggered worry, natural soothed it, so brands rewrote the story without rewriting the process. Celery powder, cultured, standardized, and lab-tested, stepped in as the quiet courier of nitrate that ferments into nitrite. The chemistry delivered the same pink and protection. The front panel delivered comfort. No nitrites or nitrates added asterisk. Then the asterisk, except those naturally occurring in celery powder. The asterisk did a lot of heavy lifting. Here's the stakes. Shoppers wanted to do right by their families without giving up the taste of ballgames and cookouts. Brands needed to hold volume while easing fears. Regulators demanded clarity that wouldn't tank an industry. The solution wasn't to ditch cure, it was to rename it, resource it, and make it look like a garden. Uncured became the keyhole word, even though these dogs walked and talked like cured meats. The word calmed nerves. The plant kept the same color card. Action looked like this in R&D. Swap direct nitrite for cultured celery juice powder plus a starter culture. Calibrate nitrate content so conversion hits the target. Keep a scorebait to police nitrosamines. Validate color and microbial safety as before. In sensory, panels couldn't tell the difference. In packaging, the copy shifted to no artificial preservatives. In procurement, a new supplier box appeared: vegetable powder, tested every lot for nitrate variability. Spreadsheet stable, shopper reassured. Meanwhile, language broadened to build a halo. Natural and all-natural flourished where rules allowed. Grass-fed, heritage pork, and organic found prime real estate on boutique SKUs that borrowed the look of a butcher shop. Craft paper patterns, hand-drawn barns, a serif font that whispered old world. Facility tour launched on social feeds. Sanitized stainless corridors, glass windows, a guide in a white coat pointing to mixers and smokehouses. Transparency became a set piece. You saw process. You didn't see the raw material spreadsheet. Impact landed in the chilled case. A premium line with 5 ingredients, beef, water, salt, celery powder, spices, sat at eye level at twice the price of the value pack below with a longer deck. The bite, close, the color, identical. The difference lived in sourcing and presentation. True craft butchers, who were already making small batch links with whole muscle trim and natural casings, watched conglomerates copy their look. Some shoppers couldn't tell the lineage apart. That was the theater. Real craft stage left, corporate craft stage right, both bathed in rustic light. Let's drop into a micro story. A young parent stands in front of the hot dog wall, phone in one hand, toddler in the cart. They Google nitrite safe and skim a quick explainer. Then they look back at 2 packs. One says uncured, no nitrites added asterisk. The other says cured with sodium nitrite, $2 cheaper. They pick the first one. The toddler points at the cartoon pig on the label and smiles. Decision made by copy and a drawing, not chemistry. Behind the curtain, ingredient minimalism met cost math. If you cut phosphates, you need tighter temperature control and higher protein extraction to keep purge down. If you skip starches, you need better meat quality and longer mix times. All that costs. Brands built clean SKUs that truly used fewer helpers and priced them to survive misses. At scale, though, corners still got found. Natural flavors doing MSG's job, carrageenan tucked in as a texture aid, or collagen trimmings swapping for isolates. The label stayed readable. The emulsion still needed a net. Another micro story. A brand copywriter rewrites a front panel. 5 simple ingredients becomes 5 real ingredients. Legal approves. The back panel lists cultured celery powder and cherry powder for cure and antioxidant. The line runs smoother because the cherry extract stabilizes color drift. Consumers read cherry and think fruit, not a reactive molecule. Facility tour became props. Cameras lingered on whole muscle trim feeds while MSM totes stayed out of frame. Guides nodded at smokehouses but didn't mention liquid smoke fractions used in other SKUs. A farmer partner waved from a pasture in drone footage, a small program attached to one premium line while the rest of the portfolio pulled from commodity channels. Nothing in the video was false. It was selective truth cast as full transparency. Taste still ruled. Clean labels that compromised the signature snap or let purge puddle in packs didn't last. Companies learned to tune natural formulations to hit nostalgia. A whisper of coriander, a steady garlic line, smoke strong enough to read on the first bite. If color dulled in week 3, returns rose. That drove better standardization of celery powder nitrate, tighter fermentation timing, and residual testing. The lab work got more precise as the words got softer. Artisan arrived on sleeves like a handshake. Some brands built real pilot kitchens and hired charcutiers to develop limited runs, coarse grind, lamb casings, peppercorn bite. Those were true craft, priced like it. Next to them, mass artisan-style SKUs used cellulose casings, fine emulsions, and familiar economics wrapped in craft fonts. Both sold. One told the truth of its scale. The other borrowed the aesthetic. Consumers brought their own shortcuts. Rustic fonts telegraphed honesty. Brown paper patterns read as eco. Words like small batch, crafted, and kettle-cooked painted pictures in heads, even if kettles were 2,000-gallon tanks. A wooden cutting board on a package front did more than a paragraph of sourcing detail. Heuristics aren't laziness, they're survival in a fluorescent aisle. Let's be clear, the clean label pivot didn't erase risks, it reframed them. Nitrite still did its job, only in a vegetable costume. Sodium stayed high unless a separate reformulation tackled it. Fat didn't vanish, but the perception shifted. People felt better buying natural. That feeling mattered more than a milligram count to most shoppers on a Tuesday night. Industry learned to segment aggressively. Value packs anchored volume with familiar decks and aggressive price points. Mid-tier lines wore no MSG, no byproducts, and no fillers, even if they used isolates or broths that did similar work under different names. Premium lines leaned into grass-fed, organic, no phosphates, and facility images. The same plant could run all 3 tiers in a day, changing stories as fast as it changed spice bin. Here's a micro story from a retailer. A category manager resets the case before Memorial Day. Eye level goes to the premium Uncured organic brand with a farm photo. Below, a store brand natural line undercuts by $1. Bottom shelf, a bulk pack with bright red plastic and a cartoon kid. Sales data later show a lift across the board. Shoppers bought the story that fit their budget and their conscience, and hot dogs rode 3 narratives to the same cookout. The Artisan theater had a ceiling. If the bite felt wrong or the dog turned gray, no font could save it. That kept companies honest in function, if not always in framing. Ingredient minimalism worked where process control was tight and distribution was short. For coast to coast, the old tricks, emulsion science, precise cures, managed smoke, stuck around under new names. Under the varnish, the core design remained. Scraps transformed by chemistry, stabilized by process, and sold by story. Clean Label didn't change the engine, it swapped the dashboard. And unless the rules changed, the theater would keep playing to full houses. Global mirrors. What other countries allow or ban? While American labels learned to soothe with Uncured, other countries rewrote the stage directions. Europe kept the same core chemistry but tightened the script. Nitrite levels in cured meats ran lower by rule in many EU nations, and several governments pushed ongoing reduction targets. The argument was practical: keep botulism defense but trim residuals where feasible. Processors adjusted cook curves, leaned harder on ascorbate, and watched color like hawks. Pink survived, just a shade softer. Steaks show up at the border. If your formula meets US limits but not EU caps, your export dreams stall. Multinationals solved it by running dual specs. EU recipe lines with lower nitrite ceilings, sometimes paler hue, and extra microbial testing. Shoppers rarely saw the split. They just bought a dog that fit local expectations. The lesson for American brands was uncomfortable. Different safety math can still produce safe franks, and color worship is cultural, not absolute. Meanwhile, mechanically separated meat lived different lives on different continents. In the US, poultry MSM became a workhorse. Beef MSM hit tighter constraints or outright exclusion in many categories. In the EU, labeling rules called out mechanically separated plainly, and certain forms, especially fine paste from crushed bones, faced stricter limits or bans. Plants pivoted to designed meat in some countries, a gentler recovery method that claimed a closer texture to trim. Regulators debated definitions for years. Consumers saw a bolder line: say what it is or don't sell it. Here's where it gets messy. Even within Europe, member states applied the same framework with different zeal. One country's acceptable MSM was another's no thanks. Labels tried to keep pace, adding terms most shoppers didn't understand. The impact was clarity by law but confusion on the shelf. Still, transparency shifted trust differently than in the US. If a pack said MSM, people could choose on purpose instead of by accident. Regional sausages raised the bar higher. Protected names, think bratwurst styles, frankfurters, or PDO/PGI specialties, came with strict definitions. Specific cuts, fat ratios, grinding methods, sometimes casings and smoke. You couldn't slip starch into a German standard that banned it and still use the name. That protection preserved craft and signaled quality without theater. Hot dogs trying to masquerade as those products had to pick a different label or a different market. In Asia, diversity ruled. Some markets embraced bouncy, fine emulsion dogs with sweeter profiles and vivid colors. Others enforced clear declarations on extenders and MMS-like inputs. Nitrite rules varied, but the same triangle, safety, color, shelf life guided decisions. Street food culture kept franks visible, convenience store rollers kept them hot. Trust leaned less on natural, copy, and more on brand repetition and government sealed. Latin America mirrored the US in love for stadium dogs and family cookouts, but often required plainer declarations on starches and soy. In some countries, beef identity mattered culturally, pushing raised claims with stricter tolerance for poultry crossovers. Nitrite use remained legal under caps, and local makers built signatures around smoke and garlic that read differently than American ballpark cues. The shared truth, engineered texture traveled well. The story changed accent. Trade friction made rules into weapons. If one bloc tightened nitrite caps, exporters cried protectionism. If another loosened MSM definitions, importers warned of a race to the bottom. Behind the press releases sat negotiation spreadsheets. Tweak a limit here, gain market share there. Consumers heard harmonization. Companies heard cost of reformulation versus value of access. Microstory, a US brand eyes a Northern European retailer. The buyer insists on lower nitrite residuals, no phosphate declaration, and a clean label list capped at 6 items. R&D tests a leaner emulsion, swaps to cherry powder for antioxidant perception, trims smoke intensity to fit local taste. The pink runs lighter, the bite stays acceptable. First shipment lands, sell-through is steady. Stateside, the same brand keeps the original formula. 2 stories, 1 factory. Some countries tackled natural language head-on. Regulators in parts of Europe argued that if you add vegetable-derived nitrite, calling it no nitrite added misleads. labels shifted. No synthetic nitrites or plain nitrate from vegetable sources. It didn't end the practice, it narrowed the wiggle room. American shoppers, by contrast, still waded through asterisks. The global mirror exposed how much of clean was diction. Casings told their own tale. Markets with enduring butcher cultures clung to natural casings for everyday links, not just premium lines. The snap signaled authenticity more than a rustic font could. In high-volume export SKUs, cellulose stayed king for speed. The choice mapped to infrastructure. Small shops slowed for tradition. Big plants chased uniformity. Regulation nudged, but culture chose. Health debates traveled too. The WHO IARC classification echoed worldwide, but responses split. Some public health agencies launched nitrite reduction programs and funded alternative tech trials. Others folded it into broader diet guidance and moved on. Where governments pressed harder, you saw labels evolve faster and price tick up accordingly. Where they didn't, marketing filled the gap with the usual reassurance. Another micro-story, an Australian chain tests no nitrite added hot dogs. Local media picks up the safety question: botulism, color, stability, shelf life. The supplier leans on vacuum packs, cold chain, and quicker turns. The line sells out for novelty, then settles into a niche. Most shoppers keep buying the classic cured option. Safety isn't a headline until it fails. Taste is a headline every weekend. What Americans see as normal, a bright pink dog, uncured, language, vague, natural flavors, isn't universal. In countries where food laws write with fewer euphemisms, trust flows differently. You build it with stricter names and tighter specs, then earn it on taste. In markets where reformulation has already shaved nitrites without killing color, the US looks conservative, married to a hue that could, in theory, be a notch lighter. Trade alignment keeps nudging the floor. When large blocks agree to ratchet nitrite caps down or demand plainer MSM terms, global producers move first, and domestic lines sometimes inherit the improvements. Not because regulation here changed, but because it's cheaper to run one smarter playbook than two. Consumers never see the memo. They just notice a slightly gentler pink that still reads right. After a century of tweaks, the basic trick stayed the same everywhere. Scraps shaped by chemistry, stabilized by process, sold by story. The differences live in how loudly the law names each step and how much color a culture insists on. The mirror doesn't shame, it shows choices. And those choices hint at what's possible if rules or expectations shift at home. The human moments. Workers, vendors, and everyday eaters start with the line. A cutter's thumb aches inside a glove as the counter blinks toward quota. The supervisor's glance means faster, not safer. When a sensor flags temp drift, hearts spike because stoppages cost bonus money and invite lectures. A text buzzes, overtime denied. Someone jokes about eating the night's defects for dinner. Nobody laughs long. Unknown to them, across town, a vendor counts singles at dawn. He buys a mixed case because the margin's better, then argues over buns that staled overnight. His cart's boiler hisses to life. First customers are construction guys, 2 each, mustered only back on the truck before the foreman turns. He wipes tongs every few serves, a habit learned from a neighbor's bad summer. A health inspector passes, a nod is currency. Meanwhile, a mom in a minivan does the weeknight calculus, homework meltdown, late meeting, practice at 6. She grabs the brand her kid won't fight, the one that doesn't squeak when bitten cold. At home, she reads Uncured and exhales, then microwaves 3 and calls it dinner. The label wins a tiny battle she didn't want to fight. Micro story, recall day. A line worker hears the announcement and thinks of rent. The plant goes quiet, then frantic. A vendor hears it on the radio and swaps brands. A little league coach checks the lot code on a cardboard sleeve and keeps serving because his case is clean. At the ballpark, a teen vendor slings 40 dogs in an inning. His best night is fireworks. His worst was rain and a dropped tray. Taste memories drown fear every 7th inning stretch. Engineer trust, sell scraps, and the crowd will cheer. The 100-year sleight of hand. Start with the through line because it's the only way the puzzle snaps into place. Scraps turned into paste, paste shaped by chemistry, chemistry hidden beneath friendly labels, and the whole thing woven into rituals until the design felt normal. That's the sleight of hand. Not a single trick, but a routine. Distract with color and nostalgia while the margins ride the grinder. Here are the stakes before the reveal lands. On one side, families trade time and money for an easy win that tastes like summer. On the other, companies manage a system that needs those trades to keep waste low and profit steady. In the middle, regulators write rules that keep food safe but leave language loose enough for storytelling. If any piece breaks, safety scare, price spike, trust collapse, the act stumbles. So the act evolved. Action, as it actually unfolded, looks plain when you line it up. First, the industry perfected a way to turn variable inputs, trimmings, MSM, fat into a uniform emulsion. Second, it used pure chemistry to fix color, flavor, and shelf life in one move, then learned the marketing angles that made those moves feel reassuring. Third, it scaled binders and process control so the bite stayed dependable across millions of links. Fourth, it swapped words whenever scrutiny rose. Pure after 1906, all meat when fillers drew heat, no nitrites added when sodium nitrite sounded scary. Fifth, it tied the product to rituals so strong that a label couldn't undo a little doubt. Impact landed in your habits. You knew what a hot dog should look and taste like, even if you never saw a spec sheet. That expectation became leverage. If a reformulation threatened hue or snap, it risked breaking the memory, so changes slid under cover of softer phrases and seasonal ad flights. The machine learned to keep the product constant and swap the story. Let's pull on the labeling thread because that's where the fingers are most obvious. Uncured appears on packages that behave like cured meats in every way that matters: color, flavor, shelf life, thanks to celery powder and ascorbate. Asterisks do the quiet labor, except those naturally occurring, clears the conscience while preserving the chemistry. Natural flavor can hide a library of extracts that steer taste as tightly as MSG ever did. All beef guides your mind to steak while it really protects species, not cut. None of it is fictional, it's carefully arranged truth. Meanwhile, crisis sharpened the routine. A recall, a documentary, a WHO headline. Each time the PR pivot refined the pitch, walk cameras through stainless corridors, put a scientist in front of a smokehouse and promise we're listening. Behind the scenes, process tweaks tighten nitrite targets, sodium nudges down, and test frequencies tick upward. The act pays off because the fix is real enough to keep the next scare smaller, and the story is warm enough to keep the next weekend normal. This was the moment everything changed, over and over without looking like change. A new word here, a color card adjusted there. A premium line launched to absorb the conscientious shopper while the value pack kept the category's heart beating. The scam, if we call it that, wasn't poison disguised as food. It was optimization disguised as innocent. Here's a micro-story that carries the reveal. A parent buys uncured natural dogs for a birthday party, feeling responsible. On the grill, the links bloom the same pink, hiss the same way, and snap like memory. Guests don't notice the wording. The host doesn't notice the lab work that standardized the celery powder, that standardized the nitrite, that fixed the color, that sold the trust. Everyone notices the laughter. The purchase feels validated. That feeling is the payoff the system chasing. Why did it work for a century? Because it solved three anxieties at once. Safety fear met a reliable hue and the phrase fully cooked. Money fear met a low unit price and heavy promotion on holidays. Identity fear, am I a good parent, host, fan, met a ritual that affirmed you. Add in the comfort of sameness and the design becomes sticky. You don't pick a hot dog, you pick a mood and the dog is bundled inside it. There's a second reveal in the economics. Transparency was never free. If plants listed hearts, tripe, and skin on value packs, many customers would flinch even if regulations allowed those parts. If they wrote mechanically separated chicken paste, they'd be more accurate and sell less. So language took the edge off. Regulators accepted classes, mechanically separated poultry, and composition limits rather than inventories of anatomy. Industry stayed within those lines and used them to keep the basket price of a party affordable. The ledger sees that as stewardship. Critics call it a shell game. What would actually change the trick? Start with pricing that reflects ingredients in plain terms, not categories that hide variability. Add standards that narrow label wiggle room. If you add vegetable-derived nitrite, you say nitrite, clearly front of pack. Tighten sodium targets with no carve-outs. Lock all beef to cuts and parts many consumers actually expect, or declare the rest without euphemism. Build procurement transparency, where a shopper can scan a code and see species, recovery method, and cure type. That's not a slogan, it's a data problem with political teeth. Here, S where the rubber meets appetite. If rules got that strict, cost would climb and the bite might change. Sales would dip at first, then two possibilities emerge. One, nostalgia proves stronger than stricter language and the category recovers with new baselines. 2. Some buyers migrate to alternatives, fresh sausages, poultry links with true low cure, or non-meat options that chase the same snap with different chemistry. Either way, the next normal would look a shade different. Another micro-story. A city council debates procurement for summer youth programs. One vendor offers no nitrites added asterisk, lower sodium, higher price. Another offers conventional cure, cheaper. A nutritionist explains the asterisk. A parent stands to say the program can't afford the premium. The council chooses the cheaper bid and adds fruit to the menu. The kids still get hot dogs. The adults file away a new fact and a familiar feeling. Budget 1. Let's talk about the safety theater phrase one last time because it's easy to mistake it for cynicism. The theater part is the language and imagery, uncured natural farm photos that stage safety as a vibe. The safety part is the process, residual testing, cook validation, sanitation, and antioxidants that actually keeps people from getting sick. The trick was pairing them so the vibe covered for the compromises and the process protected the bet. The reveal is simply acknowledging both exist. And the vibes have been carrying more weight than most people realized. The last reveal is personal. The hot dog you remember from a childhood ball game wasn't inherently pure or corrupt. It was engineered to be uncomplaining under heat, bright under fluorescent lights, and friendly to a budget. It was also part of a story that taught you to trust it. That double life, engineered and beloved, is why the system held. The scam wasn't that a hot dog is fake food. It's that the design choices hid in plain sight behind a mascot and a holiday. So what do you do with this? Maybe nothing most days, or maybe you set a few rules of your own. Save it for the weekends that deserve it. Pick labels that speak plainly, not poetically. Try a butcher's link once and taste the difference that transparency brings. Ask for standards that mean what they say. Because the routine breaks when the audience stops rewarding the misdirection and starts clapping for the craft. The hot dog endures because the story wrapped around it, color, nostalgia, and price, keeps winning over what's inside. Set your own rules, read the fine print, learn the tricks, and decide when the memory is worth the trade. If you want more true stories behind everyday foods and the corporate myths that shape them, subscribe now and watch our next deep dive feud on your screen. It connects this history to what's in your fridge this week. New episodes every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next reveal.